It's my honor to introduce our next presenter, Joe Martinez. Joe is the Chief Security Officer at Aon. He's got a long storied career from the U.S. military to Washington Mutual to JP Morgan Chase, and now as the Chief Security Officer at Aon. So, Joe, if you could come up here.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks, Joe.
Appreciate it. So thank you again for all the attendees. Good morning. And my job here is to give a little story about what we do in managing risk, or more specifically, how we manage our controls, and provide some insights, and of course, do a little bit of Q&A and take some questions from those in the crowd. So again, in terms of like how we're managing ourselves, a little bit about myself first, I'll talk about the company, and then we'll get right to the meat and potatoes about our journey and our roadmap about how we manage controls and risk. So at Aon, for those of you familiar, I manage essentially the entirety of the risk practice, as well as physical security and cyber as a Chief Security Officer. I've been there about 7 years. It's been a long journey, because I think in our industry, 7 years is probably retirement age for most folks, when the average CISO or CSO tenure tends to be around 3 years in some cases, or less. I've been doing this for quite a bit of while, for almost 30 years, in both a technical and security role. Like Mike said, before this, I was around 8 years at JP Morgan Chase, and that was the 8 years of the crazy wild ride in the financial industry of the mergers of Bank One, Chase, Bear Stearns, Washington Mutual, so all within the span of 18 months. So if those of you have done major mergers and acquisitions, I feel your pain. I've been there and have the scars to prove for that overall. I came to Chase with a few years as well, about 8 years or so at Washington Mutual. No, I was not writing bad mortgages there, but I was doing cyber and managing a lot of the information security, information protection practices in that respects. And then before that, 12 years in the U.S. military, in the Marine Corps, which is where I learned most of the practices that I got in today, where I got into the field. And I think around the year 2000 or 2001, I looked at myself and I was just getting into sort of the cyber environment. And then I said, wow, this internet thing is going to be really big, I think. And decided to take a leap of faith while I was enjoying, and I love what I did, serving our country. Took advantage of jumping into this crazy world that we call cybersecurity or information risk protection. So a little bit about the company overall. For those of you that are familiar with Aon, Aon is essentially a company around helping other companies manage risks. That's probably the simplest way to say that. We're one of the world's largest risk brokers. We're in 120 countries, about 58,000 plus employees. What we do is essentially help either large corporates or other mid-sized companies manage their risk portfolio, whether it be understanding the right pension plans for your employees, your product liability risk, your facilities risk, whatever it may be, errors and omissions, so on and so forth. So it's essentially our mantra is, better data for better decisions. And then we do that. So essentially, our business is risk management. And then I think our journey map has been trying to convince, especially within our colleagues, within our firms, that we're basically a data company that just happens to be in insurance and risk management, right? And I think a lot of folks that have been partnered with us overall, helping to essentially offset some of the risks that are residual in your place to markets that are willing to bear it, like the Lloyds and Chubbs and Beazleys of the world in terms of corporate level insurance. But that's Aon. But a little bit about sort of like, and I won't, I think this is a converted community. This is like a pastor speaking to the converted. I don't have to express to you about what the challenges that you all are facing. So I won't spend too much time here, but basically to give you some ideas that the threat landscape is continuously changing and evolving. I think you've heard that from Gaurav and the other panelists as well too. What used to be a once a year seminal event that you had to manage are now becoming once a month, and then it looks like it's going to be about once a week. That we're going to have something that is impactful enough that you have to manage to overall. Every company is a technology company, or every company is a data company, whether they like to believe it or not. And the pace of change and the pace of innovation sometimes outstrips the pace of compliance, the pace of risk, the pace of security. So it's hard to keep up, right? Features and products tend to drive a lot of what tech teams and platform teams are working on. And then our challenge is how can we make sure that goes out there in a secure, resilient, and risk-managed practice. there is not for sure an overabundance of regulatory impact. I think rightfully so, as well as commitments that we're making to both our customers and our clients. Most of our clients in my industry are other corporate entities, so they make quite prescriptive demands about what you should be doing in terms of relationships to managing either their data or their services. So on top of all the regulatory rigor and the statutory rigor, and in the countries and the domiciles you do business in, there's a lot of demands on you as a company or as a practice or as an individual in terms of where they expect you to be. There's been too many breaches and too many incidents for other folks not to have insights in terms of where you at with your security posture or your risk posture overall. The talent acquisition model, we can probably spend the whole panel today just talking about that and how do we acquire, retain, and then uplift our talents. There are around 3 million jobs available right now in the cyberspace alone worldwide, right? So, and there is potentially lots of migratory movement for folks. They have lots of options. So how do you keep the talent in your environment? How do you acquire talent to continue to grow and mature? Is everyone's challenge, and if you have success in this story, by all means, I'm all ears. So after this session, please give me some advice about how we continue to do that, because I think we all struggle with that overall. And then, of course, what I'm going to talk to you about really, where I think is the seminal piece, which is how do we measure risk in a way that's consistent, that helps us have confidence in terms of our posture, where it's at, and then how we manage those issues going forward in terms of mitigating that risk or minimizing the materiality of impact as it occurs in your environment. So what does this all lead to? So essentially, our world is being changed dynamically. The threat actors, just like you have an economy within your environment to manage your risk portfolio, lots of different stakeholders, lots of different folks contributing to an outcome. The threat actors are in the same mold, right? Right now, the forecast is by 2025, there'll be close to $10.5 trillion of economic impact as it relates to cybercrime. Today, 2022, I think we're going to land around 7 trillion and some change. So in perspective, that means if we measure that as an economy, cybercrime will be the third largest economy behind the US and China. That's how impactful, essentially, it's becoming against our world overall. So it's not abating. The forecast is like a hockey stick, like climate change. It's continuing to slope up in significant margin. So our challenge is, how can we stay at least our noses above water to manage that overall? So, okay, now, so quick snippets about how we do what we do or what we're trying to do, of course, in partnership with our good friends here at MetroStream. So what we have is really what we call the CADM model. It's a 4-pillar approach. It looks simple, but it's complicated, and then not so much technically, but to implement it to make sure that it can hit all the areas of what enterprise risk management is really sort of what we're driving at. And what you're going to see that this is mostly transferable across lots of risk domains, so security, technology, financial, operational risk, people risk, whatever it may be. So really, at the end of the day, it's controls, knowing what you're supposed to be doing. And you're going to hear language be quite specific around control effectiveness, and I was encouraged to hear others like Jacob and others that were discussing, and Gavin, around how to make sure that your controls are effective. So if you take anything away, that's really it. I think for the most part, most folks don't argue too much about what you must be doing or should be doing. All of the best practices and standards significantly overlap. All the regulatory demands and your client demands, they're pretty much telling you around your detective controls, your preventative controls, your mitigating, compensating controls. Most folks tend not to argue on what we should be doing. The question is, how are you able to understand whether those things are actually being done in your organization robustly and effectively in a standard way? So again, the first pillar is really defining what those policy standards and procedures are. The second piece is assessing that, all right? So now that you know what you must be doing, how do you check it? How do you validate it? How do you know that those things are either partially, wholly, or maybe not effective at all? And then for those things, once you assess it, of course, we call them opportunities, not challenges. You're going to have a long list of opportunities to go after. And how do you treat those, right? How do you effectively put in the set of redress necessary to fix these issues along the realm? And then lastly, the most seminal point for us is how do you measure that? Because whatever's left over, you have to make sure that it matches your risk appetite. Now, I know it may feel difference so that some folks' risk appetite said, really, is there an appetite? Yes, every corporate company has a different appetite. Some are universities and they have a wide open risk appetite. Some are, three little agencies and national governments, and their risk appetite is not very large, if at all. And most companies are somewhere in between, right, in that respect. And you have to determine what is it that you are either comfortable enough where you think you can either manage or mitigate it. But I'm here to tell you, whatever you do, it happens at the best of firms, and you can't spend your way out of the cyber/risk problem. And if anybody's a poster child, it's me, right? At the last gig at Chase, we were spending at upwards close, by the time my tenure was over, close to over $400 million on the cyber practice alone. And that sounds like a lot of money. It is. But even then, I was running security operations when the seminal breach happened in 2014. This is the 74 million household data breach that was impacted in the US. So even with all that money being spent, we still got hit. So it happens to the best of firms. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, and you have to be prepared. And then how you help to minimize that is by ensuring your controls are effective at the end of the day so that you can lower the materiality of that impact to your organization, right? So again, if you take anything away, our outcomes are really on, well, how do you measure these controls is how effective are they in terms of breadth? Is everything on where it's supposed to be at? All right, so it's one thing to say, do you have antivirus or do you have endpoint protection? And someone answers a spreadsheet and says, yes, I do. But then at the end of the day, is it on, if you have 1,000 systems, is it just on 900? Right, what about those other 100? The second portion is the depth of the control. Is it configured correctly? Right. So what, you have it on 1,000 systems that you say you're supposed to have. What if it's not configured correctly? It may not be working as intended. The control may not be working as intended. And lastly, is the fidelity of the control. So what, it's on every machine it's supposed to be on. So what if it's configured correctly? What if no one's watching it? What if no one's looking at the results? What if no one's managing the output of that control to make sure that it's working as intended? So that's what we're driving towards, really, essentially, when we say control effectiveness, the breadth, depth, and the fidelity of control. And how do you do that across a spectrum of different disciplines? Access security, network security, system security, data, security governance, and then technology controls, release management, change management, problem, software management, asset management, right? So what you're seeing here, the intention is that it's transitive across all those other sort of ERM disciplines. And then you're applying the breadth, depth, and fidelity of control measurement across all those. Now, so in action, in this, because we have this question a lot, we're recent partners to MetricStream, about 12 months in now. Overall, I know some of you have been long partners with MetricStream, and we can probably sit here and talk about their frenemies in the space. We were Archer Shop for such a long time, it just wasn't working for us. But what our intention in terms of our rollout has been for the last 12 months or so is really the platform/partner comes in the gray area box here, and this gives you a sort of an indication about our ecosystem and then how we've been implementing the solution towards getting to that sort of control effectiveness model. And really, it isn't just that. I'm also, one thing that I think we want to continue to expand on is that I also happen to be the IT for a lot of the risk practices in our firm. So the platforms for legal, privacy, controllership, audit, compliance also fall under my remit. And it's been helpful to sort of think about how we're going to merge their needs into a common platform as well too. So not just tell a story around security risk and even technology risk, but also potentially just a good portion of the enterprise risk space as a whole. All right, now, again, you'll see the CATA model here for us, controls, assessments, treatment, measurement, and then where within those silos we're applying the substructures around how we manage our policies and procedures and standards, how we integrate the workflow with other downstream systems, like where work gets done at, so like Jira for developers or ServiceNow for our IT system administrators and the like. And then essentially how we report out our risk dashboard for sort of our health or heat map as how our controls are doing. Now, our output looks almost exactly like you saw on the previous page, which is, again, how effective the controls are. And then what we've been landing on is essentially to give a rating, give a number, right? So that when you say our access management control is 83% effective, well, how do you get to that? Well, We're measuring privilege access management. We're measuring essentially our directory services. We're measuring our multi-factor authentication, our single sign-on. And then those sub-areas are contributing, right? So we're making measurement points against those sub-area domains. And then we roll that up to a top-level domain, and we call that access security or access management, and then try to give it a score. Again, not to be exhaustive, but you need to be comprehensive as much as possible in trying to do that across the board. And then that's our intention. The biggest struggle there is really the inputs in terms of like, well, what's feeding this engine? Like what actually gets into here? And again, best practices, right? So this is really a NIST-based model when you hear me speaking to it, but ISO, COBIT, all the frameworks that are out there, because the demands are that you're going to be asked to probably vector your environment against any one of those views. We're vectoring against an Aon control framework that we map to these other external best practices, right? So we're not a COBIT shop or a NIST shop or ISO shop, whatever it may be. We support those frameworks, of course, but we have to manage to what is to our risk appetite and to our control library. And then we can show the association about how we map to those other frameworks externally, right? So there's great partners in this space like the Unified Compliance Framework and others that help you rationalize all these other sort of external statutory as well as best practice demands, and it can help bridge that into what is your control library, what is your control sort of framework, and what are you measuring against overall. So, wrapping it all together, it gives you some ideas about how we're sort of purpose-driven around the word control effectiveness, and then some advice in terms of like how we've seen the space, both in talking to a lot of clients as a risk sort of broker, risk manager, and then as well as talking to a lot of CISOs like myself and others in this space here. Really, one is whatever you do, baseline your environments without exception. It's really difficult because if you don't, like my mantra is you can't really manage what you don't know and you can't secure what you don't manage. So whether the story is a great story and the controls and the risks that are being managed are being done well, or it's a modest story, right? You're on a journey, or it's a working story, whether you have a lot of opportunities, as we call them, to work through overall, but you have to baseline. You have to know where you're starting from, sort of like in the financial term, like truth in lending. You have to really be honest about where you're at. There's no sense in hiding risks or hiding control deficiencies because it catches up with you, no matter how hard you try. So be honest both with your leadership, your board, as well as your colleagues, organizations, and your customers and clients. And then I think then you can build a roadmap as to what the from and to is overall. You want to build awareness and security IQ amongst your organization, your front line of defense are your colleagues, your employees. No matter how big of a security organization or risk organization you may have, at the end of the day, those that are interacting most with your customers and clients are the ones best suited to help manage risk for the firm wholesale. Right? So empowering them to understand what part they play in the security agenda or the risk agenda is critically important. But you'll also find, and particularly us, for those US-based companies, you're going to see this be almost double down on as it relates to also building security IQ and awareness for your leadership and your board. The SEC has proposed rules already coming to fruition between either the end of this year or beginning of next year. That's going to require boards to validate their cybersecurity expertise and whether or not they're doing the right appropriate oversight on this space. So the demand is going to come one way or another. I know sometimes some organizations have struggled to sort of, how can I get the board online with my risk and security strategy? But for sure, you want to build that awareness and IQ overall. One thing that we try to focus on as well is our fundamentals in IT and fundamentals in security. Even though a lot of attraction is focused on the novel attacks and the nation state attacks, they do happen, they do occur. We'd be kidding ourselves if we think that they don't. Most of what occurs is really sometimes a breakdown of the core fundamentals. Do you know all the assets that are in your organizations? And that's a hard question to solve for if you're a big company or even a modest-sized company. Unless you're running sort of a two-person law firm where two servers, most of us aren't, you have a lot of applications, services, APIs, URLs, websites, and the like in business services that it makes it complicated to know all the things that are being built and used, and you want to have a good set of fundamentals overall. Because I think we find the breakdown of fundamentals is what tend to really burn, unfortunately, a lot of companies when these big exposures happen. It's a breakdown of access security. It's a breakdown of not knowing your assets or vulnerability management potentially, or not patching as appropriately or as quickly as possible. You do want to simulate. You want a war game. This is important. You only get good at this space by practice. If you're in an industry where you're getting hit a lot, so I want to say apologies, but also you're probably well-heeled and well-oiled, knowing how to respond and knowing how to take corrective action overall. Some of us don't get hit as often, but my encouragement would be is that you have to simulate in a war game. You have to have an understanding as to what everyone's role in an incident response is, or an event response is, and what decisions you're going to make. When do you shut down manufacturing? When do you shut down your Singapore operations? Right? When do you have to notify the regulator? Right? When do you bring in outside counsel or an external firm? Right? Don't wait for these decisions to be made in the middle of the firefight. Right? Practice this ahead of time and ask yourself these questions overall before they occur. And then, of course, measure again. So that's the resounding refrain across the board. And then lastly, like here, in this network here, this is always great opportunities. I love these events because you tend to learn a heck of a lot more, not disparaging our partners and vendors. We love you, but at the end of the day, I think you get so much insights from other folks that are in the fight, either struggling or having successes, and then understanding what folks have gone through, and then learning from those and applying those within your organization sometimes tend to be the best sort of sets of engagement overall. So that's our story about how we're trying to manage risk overall. Hopefully, if you have questions, happy to take them. But Mike,
Excellent.
To come back if you can.
All right, thank you, Joe. I'm going to ask Joe a couple questions based on the presentation, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So if you guys want to think of a couple questions too, we'll call on you guys here. So, Joe, let me just start off with the first question based on what you just presented there. You made a great point about how everyone passes audit inspections and reviews, but there's still increased breaches. Why is that, and what can people do about it?
No, that's right. Yeah, so one of the lines in the presentation that I had there is that there's probably a little bit of a disconnect between all of the external audits, all the internal audits, all of the risk and security assessments, all the spreadsheets that are flying throughout, all the questionnaires. There's lots of models about how to be able to do that. But at the end of the day, there's still an inherent sort of issue where there's still the pace and velocity of breaches and attacks are almost running unbound. All right, so is there a disconnect? And we think, is there a disconnect about how we're measuring risks to make sure that we can help mitigate that, or at least level it off? Because I think the argument is we don't believe it's being leveled off, that it's continuing to climb at pace. And really what we're trying to do is, and what you hear me say is, instead of focusing so much about risk, I think we all know what we're supposed to be managing for, like what controls we expect in our environment. Our intention is to really drive whether or not if those controls are truly effective. And if you start asking that question, if you start asking the detail, the less you can ask that question to a human, the better. Right? So we need to be able to automate. I think you heard Gaurav and the team focus on where they're going to move around continuous compliance and continuous monitoring. I think it's critical. Right? There's no sense in asking a person whether or not is all of your passwords complex and are they alphanumeric and whatever it may be, whatever the control needs to be. Technology should be able to answer that on a human's behalf. Because again, leave the humans to the high order function things like, is your process controls effective? Or are your services effective that are mitigating risk? So we're anticipating that we will make some progress here if 70 to 80% of what we're asking in terms of these assessments is either automated or using advanced technologies like ML and AI to help tell that story of whether the controls are effective. And in doing so, helps us have a more honest conversation. Because one thing we don't do is to struggle. Like right now, we send questionnaires out to our partners and third parties, but you're letting someone human answer that back for you. I think we want the system, we want the environment to be able to answer those and be a little bit more open overall. That's one of the biggest struggles in the insurance industry. It's difficult to get efficacy of controls when you don't have the insights and you're not in someone's environment to truly understand where they stand at, to then measure risk and quantify it and then bank that risk. So I think the industry as a whole still has some work to do, but I think as we get more comfortable sharing where we're at and then sort of standardizing that, I think we'll make some progress.
All right. So Joe, with the controlled framework you described earlier, how long did that process take, and what were the challenges implementing?
We're still on a journey, yeah. So nothing's done in this space. Nothing's ever done in this space. So our ideas have been, I've been with the firm about 7 years. About half of that we've been going through. We knew that we wanted to develop something more broader, more robust. And particularly as it relates to sort of like the insurance industry, our conversations with the markets have been is that, like I said earlier, they have challenges truly understanding where these companies are at. If we were discussing, let's say, if you were Uber and how you wanted to insure all your vehicles and your drivers, we can come to an understanding between both the client and the insurer as to where that risk is really at. If you say, hey, here's my footprint for my facilities worldwide, can we model that risk out? And the answer is yes. Or if you want to model a bunch of other risks, you can get to agreement. It's difficult to model risk out for cyber. There's lots of different ways to skin that cat, but there's really no standard way where you and I can agree together in a transparent way where that risk is at overall. So that was the question that we were trying to answer. That's the problem that we were trying to solve for. And our landing spot was, if we can measure how effective these controls are, we think we can push the bar a little bit further in terms of transparency, not just within the company, but also outside of a company as well, too.
Great. So I'd love to open it up to the audience here for any questions for Joe based on the presentation. So anybody in the audience have any questions?
There's one in the corner, Mike.
Got a question over here? So if you could stand maybe, or we could mic that, Olga, if we could mic. So give us a second here.
I think you. Okay, it's on, yeah. I think you spoke to risk appetite and measuring the maturity of the organization, of the controls. So what are the practical ways of quantifying that risk appetite, and how do you integrate that into the measurement of the maturity of the controls?
No, it's a great question, and thank you for that. One thing you saw in the framework is there's sort of not a list of like where your threats are. There's an entry in there about your inputs, about understanding your realized events, like what's occurred to you. But the risk appetite, it's a funny question. We just talked about this last week in our team. You can have a conversation with the business and say, well, how comfortable would you be for how often we have to have a seminal event or material event? Once every 10 years, once every 5 years, once a year? And you may be able to sort of settle that question and say, well, I think we can deal with one of these once every 10 years if it were to happen to us, where it's a public event and we can sort of get through that. You may be able to get to that question. If you were to ask your customers that question, or your clients, how often would you like for your data to be compromised? The answer is never. The answer is never. The risk appetite is none. All right. But again, you have finite resources and finite time within your organization. And you can't get to perfect in all places, and that's one of our mantras, which is never let perfect be the enemy of the good. You have to make substantial progress where possible, so you have to have a line. It could be whether it's, like for us, I'll give you an example. For us, our risk appetite, we sort of draw a hard line on things that are the most highest risk assets, our highest revenue generating applications and technologies, our internet-facing estate, and our regulatory estate, right? For those, there's zero tolerance. The risk appetite is none. We want to make sure that we're managing exquisitely as much as possible in each of those three environments. The rest of it, I think we may not be honest if we're saying, well, I want the same across all my organization, right? For us, when you have tens of thousands of things to have to manage and the spate of churn, not everything is going to be exactly perfect, or it may go out secure or very well risk managed and risk defined, but it may not stay that way, right, throughout its life cycle. So you're always having to make sort of a negotiated conversation about what appetite for risk you're comfortable with overall. But really, that's really a conversation between yourself and your business lines or your solution lines. You should be having that conversation with the business heads, not so much within sort of risk and tech only. Because for us, our business is accountable for the risk, not me, the CSO, or our security team, or the controller, or the chief auditor. The business is really ultimately accountable for the risk. In that respect, the question is, how do you educate them to make them aware of what that is, and then get to a conversation about, how comfortable you are with the level of investment versus the level of impact we may have managing risk overall.
All right. Any other questions from the audience? All right.
Yep. One more.
We probably can have you just ask if you're right up front.
One
here.
more.
Okay.
Mike, I think
Oh, in the back. Oh, I'm sorry.
on the maturity piece of the question, how do you communicate the maturity to the board?
Yes, I have my board meeting next week in Ireland on the 17th, so it's timely and appropriate. So we've linked our maturity to a standard CMMI, right? So we've taken our ERM domains, operational risk, financial, security, technology, people, and then each one of those are sort of flagged against a CMMI model, right? Whether it's repeatable, initial, managed, optimized. Pick a CMMI model that you feel most comfortable with. And then what we're doing is that we're mapping our control effectiveness ratings to the CMMI. It's a math problem, so you can say, okay, well, if things are ineffective, maybe in the initial stage. If things have made some progress, maybe within the repeatable stage. So that's the way we've sort of done that discrete mapping ourselves. But we've done that across all of our domains, right? So within security, the ERM domain of security, we have network, systems, access, data, security sub areas. And then those are managed, those are measured by control effectiveness. And then they wrap up to a CMMI rating of total for the board there. I think it's difficult to have a board conversation on sort of technical details of control effectiveness and breadth and depth. I think you may lose them, but you can say, look, our maturity is inclining here. The struggle is that maturity slide is not a straight line that continues going up. If your threats change, if your risks change, that you have to sort of level the expectation that maturity may go back down. Right? And that's actually quite notable. If you have an incident, if you have a breach, obviously that's the best expression of whether you're at in your maturity. And that's hard, right? Sometimes that's hard to do when most folks expect that you're just always just moving up. But it's always a conversation.
So I'm getting flagged right now for us to stick on schedule here. So I would just ask if there's any more questions for Joe. You can grab them on the break. Joe,
Sure.
You're going to be here the next
Absolutely. I'll be here.
2 days. So, Joe, if I could just conclude with one question. You concluded your great advice for risk leaders. What's one piece of advice you would give a young chief security officer starting out?
Network. I wish someone would have told me that earlier. Sometimes, hubris plays a heart pain. It is that you don't have all the answers. It's okay to not know everything. But network, right? There's so many folks that are going through the same journey you're going to go through or are going through. And some of them have a lot of scars on their backs in terms of like what worked and what didn't work, right? And getting that advice, it would be invaluable to you to get that advice early and often or where you can. And if you don't know who to reach out to, come to events like these, talk to folks around the tables here. I know some of our industries tend to be a little bit closed vest. You don't want to tell folks where you're really at. Trust me when I tell you, I've talked to enough CISOs. I have a strong network of CISOs. Everyone's in the same boat, believe it or not. Everyone's in the same boat. We all have a lot of things that have to resolve for. You shouldn't be surprised about being surprised, as I like to say. When you talk to others, say, wait a minute, you're having the same problems too? Yes, we are. And I think you'll learn a tremendous amount of insights networking.
Well, Joe,
Yeah.
well, Joe, let me thank you. Truly appreciate
My pleasure.
us having the opportunity to continue this GRC journey with you at Aon. And how about a round of applause for Joe?
Thank you.